Let me start with some observations about the economic situation that surrounds us. Beginning with Virginia, as we know now, the state's revenue shortfalls to meet the cost of the budgets enacted last year now are substantially in excess of the $2.9 billion estimated in the fourth quarter when the governor had the revenue estimated. I should say that one of the fundamental dilemmas that state policymakers face is that they do not know how many quarters to predict. We have, as you know, a recession that was 4 quarters along before the federal government acknowledged its existence. State officials talk about a recession that may last 4 or 5 quarters or may last 8 quarters. The problem with 8 quarters is that that's as far ahead in time as the model goes. So if one plans on 8 quarters, one is simply saying that one cannot see the end or the bottom of this cycle. In the governor's proposed budgets for 2007, 8, 9, 10, we're now facing a total of 3 rounds of cuts. The fiscal year ends in the second year of a biennium at the end of June. In fiscal 08, the governor had to take out 6.5% of our general fund, which was $9.2 million. Fiscal 09, the governors had to take out $10.6 million, or 7% of what remained. And in the legislature's budget that the governor submitted at the start of the session and the budget that will eventually get considered, the total reduction proposed for us is 8% of what remains, and that is $12.5 million. So we have seen a series of reductions in state support, and we will see more, because the state simply does not have the revenue to carry out the work that it's committed to doing. The total that we have absorbed so far, and let me emphasize that we have absorbed already, is $32.3 million, or 21.25% of the state budget with which we began the biennium. That's not as dramatic as what we absorbed in 2001, 2002, when the governor removed, I think, $52 million altogether. It is a little more severe than most of the reductions, but if you go back to the reductions of 1990-91, although the base is much lower, these reductions are similar in scale. The governor's other proposals to save money have to do with a number of things that affect us, but I want to mention some that have special impact on the academic program. He's eliminating the state match that's provided under the Eminent Scholars Program. Now, the state has not met its statutory obligation to match income from endowed chairs in that program on a one-to-one basis for decades. The program was put into the code in 1964. The $2.8 million proposed to be removed at this time would end the program. We have been working on finding legislative support for addressing some of these cuts. The governor's proposals are not hostile. He's simply trying to find the money that he needs. But in any event, we do find some support for putting some token money back into that account. For those of you who raise money or who are involved in funding endowed chairs, that contribution is an essential part of what the state does. Some of our schools, including the law school, have been very much engaged in the program. And so some of the faculties that are most heavily dependent on endowed funds are also directly involved in these reductions. We're delaying 2 major capital projects under the governor's proposal. One is the gutting and restoration, the renovation of New Cabell Hall, which would be the final phase of the South Lawn project. The other is renovation of Ruffner Hall. The reason in those cases is that those projects are in bond bills, and the state is not at this point certain as to what its debt capacity actually is. I should say that the concern is not exactly technical, that it's political concern. The state may not be able to meet its obligations, may someday lose its AAA bond rating, and so on. The governor's budget provides no salary increases with state funding in both 2009 and 2010. So we would have 2 consecutive years with no general salary increases. Because, as I will explain in a moment, the legislature is not currently working directly on the budget. It's difficult to predict whether or not the legislature will be able to accept that recommendation, because state employees everywhere are affected. And with the proposal, the first, I think since 1974, to reduce state funding for the SOQ that drives local school budgets, There is enormous furor among employees everywhere about the loss of these salary increases. State research funding has been cut for us by 8%. It hasn't been eliminated, but the cut is in cancer research. The work that's being done is essential. We have restored the funds to maintain the program. The governor is proposing $26 million in new money for additional student financial aid. None of our students will receive that money under the current proposal because we meet their needs from university resources. We are attempting to get some of that money reallocated so that our students can benefit. The governor is proposing no restrictions on increases in tuition and fees. The reasons are pretty straightforward. With the reductions, virtually all, maybe all of the universities and colleges in the state will face the same problem, and that is that they have inevitable new expenses that have to be paid. And without general fund money to pay them, their only real source is going to be tuition. In all cases, the increasing cost of student financial aid will be covered in the increases. Most of the colleges and universities are tracking the numbers that are in the restructuring plans. So they're showing 9 to 9.5% as a typical increase. But in any event, as more parents become unemployed, more students qualify for financial aid. And because that is a fact of life, all of our institutions, community colleges, four-year schools, colleges, universities, all face the same problem. Virginia's unemployment rate, by the way, has gone to something like 5.3% in the December numbers. The previous year was 3.2%. We've lost several thousand jobs in January, so the rate will be continuing to track up on a statewide basis. There's no money in the budget for new buildings that have large operating costs. The ones that are most concerned to us are the Medical Education Building number 2, Bavaro Hall, and the South Lawn. The total cost of operating those structures is $1.7 million, and that has to be built into a tuition increase. We have a statewide contractual increase in the cost of electricity that affects all institutions. If you take just the E&G cost here, that is facilities that are used for the educational purposes of the university, that adds $3.1 million to the cost of operation. That goes into the tuition increase. And then there are health care and other benefits costs that are mandatory under the various contracts and laws that apply. And for the E&G employees, that comes to $4.5 million. So all of that has to be built into tuition increases. The total, by the way, that I just described comes to about $10 million. By coincidence, $1 million this year is about 1% of our tuition revenue. So it's a fairly easy calculation to make. Probably this year only, though, because it wouldn't be that way in every year. The General Assembly plans to adjourn on February the 28th. The leaders are saying now that it's not clear that they can adopt a budget by that date. They're concerned about the uncertainties involved in the federal stimulus package. They do not know what's going on with state revenue, and they're very much concerned about whether or not they can predict econometrically the duration of the recession. They have their minds on other issues. And as in any legislative session, there's a certain amount of raw politics. I should emphasize, though, that the issues they're dealing with this year are different from what we've seen in prior years when they adjourned without a budget. They're very clear that they have to have the revenue from somewhere to run whatever they commit to running. They're not talking about new taxes, but they are very much engaged in the attempt to determine what to do with the governor's proposals. After they adjourn on February 28th, the governor has 30 days, this year that goes to March the 30th, to amend, approve, veto, or take no action on the bills that are passed along to him. There will be a reconvened session on April the 8th, and then, as in prior years, very possibly one or more additional reconvened sessions if the General Assembly has left Richmond on February the 28th without a budget. It's also possible, by the way, that they could deal with the amendment budget for the current fiscal year. We're in a biennial cycle where this is the first year. So they're meeting at this time of the year. The budget on which they are likeliest to act first is the one that goes to the end of June. That's a reduction budget. and then they will look at what they can do with regard to the next year. We are seeking a number of budget amendments to repair some of the damage that's implicit in what I reported and to encourage further attention to capital projects. That's important because most unemployment in our region is blue-collar unemployment. And in prior recessions, we have in effect built this region's way out of recession by providing large numbers of jobs on projects that last through the recession and beyond it. Our large projects, as you know, can take 3-4 years to do completely. So they're a very important part of the employment picture here and in other parts of Virginia. There are proposals in the General Assembly that have to do with changing the state law that has to do with the enrollment of in-state students. The debates this year are intense. Many of the facts that have been asserted to attack out-of-state students or enrollments are not good facts. And as you've probably followed in the newspapers, there have been repeated assertions and then corrections over the course of the last several weeks. This terrain shifts constantly from hour to hour. The assertions and the demands change every day. After talking with Leonard and Colette, who've been working this issue with me, have decided that it's really not useful in terms of your time for us to try to recite every proposal, every problem with every proposal, and so on. The fundamentals of the issue are efforts to mandate spaces in the state's more desirable colleges and universities, particularly here, for additional in-state students, particularly students from the districts of legislators who advocate the proposals. Others have focused on increasing the number of spaces, happily not here because we have one of the highest proportions in our transfer class of students from the community colleges, but increasing the number of spaces in the colleges for community college students. We have been working, we continue to work with legislators who are engaged with the issue. We're trying to point out the considerable hazards of unintended consequences in changes that have to do with the basic revenue stream. Out-of-state students pay much more tuition, therefore much more of the salary account, much more of the financial aid account, and so on, than do in-state students or in-state students in the state combined. We have seen substantial growth over the years, by the way, in the number of in-state Virginia students. Since about 1990, when the state stopped paying for growth, we've added in our entering classes about 1,810 students. So the growth in the number of in-state students here has been, if anything, a little bit ahead of demand. But demand is dramatic, and we are committed to educating Virginia students. We also believe strongly that a diverse student body benefits everyone, and that there has to be some basis to pay for whatever proposals are adopted. I can't speculate today on how this may turn out. I guess the best advice is stay tuned, but be aware that the issues are very large when you start trying to figure out what it takes to pay for the university. Virginia does not have, and has not had since the car tax reductions of a decade or so, enough money to pay its bills. The problem with regard to paying for enrollment, with regard to paying for adequate highways and so on, all has to do with that fundamental and frankly unanalyzed change in state financial policy. The undisclosed recession of the fourth quarter of 2007 through the fourth quarter of 2008 has made the shortfall dramatically worse. State planners, like all other planners, trusted the federal numbers and believed during those 4 quarters of recession that we were being told the truth. When it turned out that we were not, the basic assumptions used in the model suddenly crashed. And you recall that on learning that, the governor had to adjust his projection and found almost double the shortfall in anticipated revenues that had been projected on the basis of the prior numbers. So Virginia's leaders got fooled, just as frankly all of us did, because state budget planners believed the U.S. Treasury, they believed other federal agencies when they told us that we had no recession for a whole year. And the numbers that eventually floated up, as you know, showed that the recession was not only in progress, but that it was accelerating dramatically from one quarter to the next. That's the core of the current year's revenue problem. The deepest concern among Virginia's voters has to do with really two things, both related to the unanticipated effects of the car tax changes. And that has to do with highway construction, which is the biggest issue everywhere. If you travel through northern Virginia at any hour except maybe 3 o'clock in the morning, you can see immediately why people are so concerned about the lack of progress on that. And the other crisis has to do with enrollment spaces for in-state students. Students in Virginia tend to be superbly prepared, especially in northern Virginia. They wish to go to top-tier institutions. When we are underpriced, as we were for a good bit of the 90s, or when there's a recession that makes the major national private universities overpriced for most families, the pressure grows much more intense. So I think it's an understandable phenomenon. I doubt that anyone likes the absence of state support for growth, but it has not been there for almost 20 years. And we are facing the cost of that period of neglect. Many legislators are counting on the federal stimulus package to make the highway problem go away. It may do that. There is a spreadsheet that was released by the House about 10 days ago that shows about $750 billion altogether for highway work. So if that number holds, and if the money is spent over the course of the 2 years that the president's talking about, we will see a dramatic increase in the amount of activities involved with the highways. There is no federal stimulus proposal that compensates for the systematic underfunding of Virginia's colleges and universities since 1990. That simply isn't on the president's or anyone else's plate in Washington. Enrollment pressure is a major issue in this state, and that's especially true with regard to the desire of students to come here. So that's the crux of the issue. The federal stimulus itself. Last week, the House passed its version of the package. Senate Appropriations and Finance Committees issued their reports. This week, the Senate itself is working on the bill. Reconciling the proposals is a big and complex job because they are not particularly similar. The best reconciliation we've seen was distributed yesterday by the AAU. There will be copies at the doors as you leave. I'll be more than happy to send copies by email if you want additional copies or your own copy. And we have posted the AAU's publication on a special website that is virginia.edu/budget impact, written as one word. There will be a number of documents there that are related to what we're doing to deal with the impact of both federal and state budget actions. Both federal bills would give the states about $39 billion to prevent cuts to their systems of education. The distribution among states is to be based on population. The split between K-12 and higher education is not spelled out. So there is a fundamental problem in understanding how the funds would affect the entire system. Both bills contain what I guess I'd have to call enigmatic language. There are some that I can't explain, and senators and representatives are trying to reconcile the language. To the extent that the subtleties can be explained now, they're in the handouts that will be at the doors as you leave. Both bills increase funding for student financial aid. The specifics and the amounts are different. Neither bill addresses the fundamental structural defects in the federal financial aid system, so it's difficult to imagine that the problem gets solved simply because of this action. On the other hand, maybe in the reconciliation of the two bills, there will be a chance for people who really understand financial aid to explain some of why it doesn't work. And maybe in the end, the federal system will improve because of those discussions. There is substantial money for the federal research agencies, NIH, NSF, the Department of Energy, the Department of Agriculture, the Research Facilities Program at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, this is NIST, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. Those dollars flow eventually through the processes to qualified researchers in colleges and universities. They should be a first focus of our department heads and research center heads and deans as we plan how to sustain scientific research, especially in the couple of years during which the president wants those dollars spent. Funding for infrastructure, which appears to mean inadequate buildings in colleges and universities, is in both the House and the Senate bills. They differ. $6 billion in the House, $3.5 billion in the Senate. It's not exactly clear what they have in mind, but from the discussions, I believe one can infer that they're attempting to pay the cost of our national underinvestment in science. That appears to me to have potential benefit for us, because we are a classic case of underinvestment in science over the course of a couple of generations. So I'm hoping that we will see opportunities there to qualify for fairly substantial investments in science facilities. We expect that the legislation can emerge from the houses as early as next week. The president is pushing for that. I don't really know what obstacles there may be, but we will post anything that we know on the website that I mentioned, virginia.edu/budget impact, and try to keep you up to date. Comments on the overall university budget. We're faring better than many and perhaps most of the national private universities in the Northeast. There are a number of reasons, but a fundamental one is that many or most of them are dependent on basically one major revenue source, which is endowment income, which is complemented or supplemented by tuition income. Although tuition income in private universities is not a simple function of multiplying the number of students by the listed tuition charge, because tuition discounting occurs everywhere. And in the private sector, it's very difficult to come up with norms to predict what the institution will receive in the end from tuition. But looking at the endowments, it's not uncommon for 35% or more of the major universities' expenditure budgets to come from their endowments. In the announcements from Harvard about a month ago, it was disclosed that about 36% of the budget was endowment driven. In announcements last week from Cornell, which I'll mention again in a moment, the figure given was about 35%. Those endowments have in general lost marginally more, somewhat more than U.Va. has lost in their core value. In many instances, they have not disclosed exactly what they've lost. They're not required to. At one time, we were sort of in the middle of the news because U.Va. discloses its results every month on its website. We will keep disclosing, but it's interesting to note that as others have disclosed, we have become less of a story, simply because U.Va. has done a better job. Chris Brightman and his colleagues, I think, deserve a good bit of credit. There are other reasons why we are in somewhat better shape. We spend less on non-academic functions. There are functions in which I would like to spend more. I'd like to see us do a better job, for example, with intramural recreation and extend it so that it includes all of our students and many faculty members, but we do not have the funds to do what is done at Princeton or at Harvard in that area. We started trimming early. We've done this repeatedly when we saw recessions coming. And we did it because the economy simply didn't feel right during those 4 quarters when the government kept saying that we had no recession. So Leonard Sandridge and others who do the financial plotting did a good job of putting us into a position to deal with the downturn that in fact we have. Cornell's announcements of last week, and the most important one, or the easiest one to follow, is the President David Skorton's letter to the Cornell community explaining what Cornell was doing. But Cornell's announcements of last week are a good and frankly uncommonly straightforward sample of how deeply the national private universities have been hurt. David's letter looks very much like the kinds of letters that we sent to explain what the impact is on us. And I have to say I admire him for telling the story straight. If you'd like to see what's happening elsewhere, look at that. You may recall also that there have been stories in the press about a decision on the part of the Brandeis administration and board to sell that university's art museum and close the facility. I have learned in the last couple of days that there's considerable resistance to that proposal. and that probably the art market could not produce the kind of revenue from the sale of the collections revenues that were imagined. But in any event, for Brandeis, which values that museum, that's a fairly dramatic step, and another clue as to how serious the problems are. I think it's clear that in this meltdown, very little is certain. And I make another observation, and that is that having diverse revenue sources, rather than being so dramatically dependent on a single source, is turning out to be far better than having the kind of intense dependence, say, on endowment revenue that Harvard and Cornell have revealed, or to go to a different situation, relying 28 to 30% on state dollars, as we did prior to the cuts in the early 90s, learning how to generate other funds and how to maintain other fund flows, has turned out to be one of the most important disciplines that we have learned in these 20 years. The fund sources in the budget that the Board of Visitors has approved for the current fiscal year are these. Tuition and fees account for 16.2% of the total. That's $362.5 million. The 16.2% is up from 15.1% if you go back about 5 years to 2003, 2004. So there is a progressive but slow shift in the direction of depending on tuition dollars. Frankly, it matches the loss of state dollars. It's a balancing number. For the academic division, tuition and fees amounts to 29% of the budget. Remember that budgets are reported in two ways, the entire institution and the academic division. It's not unnatural that the academic division is dependent on tuition. That's its business. Tuition payers are its customers, but it's 29%. The state appropriation prior to the reductions that I described earlier was about $184.5 million overall. It's obvious that the reductions will reduce the percentage of state money in the budget eventually, but frankly, I don't know what it will be. We're hoping that it'll wind up being somewhere in the range of 8% of the total budget, simply because we've learned to manage at about 8%. Patient revenues, and here's a figure that may surprise you if you don't follow the hospital's business. Patient revenues amount to 43.9% of the budget. It's $980 million. It's an increasing percentage. In 2003-04, it was 41.5%. Another way to put it is that the hospital has become a major driver of the economy that is built around the university. And it is much more dramatic as a driver now than it was 10 years or 20 years ago. Sponsored programs amount to 13.2% of the budget. For those of you who are students, sponsored programs means basically the revenue that faculty members earn through funded research. It's $296 million. 5 years ago, it was $212 million. So the growth in sponsored research is a fundamental reason for the health of the budget. Auxiliary enterprises, which means dormitories, dining halls, athletics programs, and so on, 7.2% of the budget, $162 million. That source is fairly flat, and the reason is simply that we've had to contain fees as we've had to shift more expense into the tuition budget. And we're trying to keep the total cost of attendance under control. There are times when you simply have to increase fees because inflation drives up the cost. But the contractors who run the various functions, certainly Leonard and Collette and others, have done a very good job of controlling those costs. Gifts and endowment, the expendable income, 9.1% of the budget, or 203.7% of the, 9.1% or $203.7 million. Oddly enough, the distribution is increasing because the board has modified the formula that determines how much you spend of equity, even though the equity value has gone down. So endowment income has remained a very stable part of the budget this year. Our schools, as you know, keep what they raise from their own donors. Deans have reserve funds, some of them are substantial. We've talked for a decade about shifting toward all funds budgeting, which means counting all of the funds available to the schools, including their foundations and their gift flow and other sources. and committing those funds before faculty work is cut, suffers, loses support in tough times. Budgeting in this way is frankly fundamental to the whole self-sufficiency model. It's time for us to do that systematically, and I've asked Leonard Sandridge and Dr. Garson to make sure that it happens this year. Using all of our unrestricted funds in a disciplined and accountable way so that everyone has a way to know where the money is, I think, our best hope of managing through the next year or so without having to damage academic programs, and also to pay for improvement as the chance comes. A few words about the endowment. UVMCO's long-term pool, which includes the rector and visitors' investments, most of the related foundations' endowment funds, has dropped about 25% in the third and fourth quarters of 2008. It's gone from about $5.1 billion on June 30th to about $3.9 billion on December 31st. The numbers reflect complete mark-to-market accounting. I need to explain, and that includes, by the way, all private funds. They're all mark-to-market. I need to explain that what that means is that on any given day, the value that UVMCO reports is the real value in the marketplace. What can you sell what you have for? It's a very rigorous accounting discipline. In effect, it sets aside marking to book, which is an older discipline, and says instead that you mark to what you're really worth. So the fact that other institutions have begun marking to market as they realized they had to in these times has had the effect of demonstrating that UVMCO's discipline was the right discipline from the beginning. As of November the 31st, the returns over time are worth looking at because we are a long-term investor. We don't invest for the short term, we invest for the long duration. Multi-year returns, over 3 years, 2.2%. That's after taking the 25% loss. Over 5 years, 6.9%. Over 10 years, 10.8%. Over 20 years, 12.1%. For what it's worth, the S&P 500 returned 1.4% over the course of the last decade. So if you had a choice, you'd rather have UVMCO's return, which is about 5 times as good. The board increased the payout on the endowment in each of the last 2 years. The current payout ratio is 5% of the value of equity. Endowments do not pay interest in the sense in which we know interest from savings accounts. And they don't issue dividends in the way in which companies in which we might hold stock issue dividends. Instead, what they do is calculate their actual value and distribute a percentage of value. That discipline within the endowment is the reason why the funds available for distribution this year are going up, even though the value of the corpus has gone down. And we will make the distribution as planned. And the 5% was calculated on June the 30th as the rule says it should be. So there are a number of benefits in there for programs that rely on endowed fund distributions. The effect of the economy on financial aid is complicated to assess, but it's there. Need is bound to go up. Unemployed parents have trouble paying tuition. And as I mentioned before, Virginia's unemployment rate is accelerating. It's almost doubled in the last year. If the January numbers existed, it may well have doubled completely. Our region tends to be somewhat less prone to unemployment than do others. But it's not rocket science to predict an unemployment rate that could reach 7.5% or 10% over the course of another year or so. If the current phenomenon of closing manufacturing facilities and so on were to continue. Many of the funds that are required for financial aid come from donors. We're working to acquire those, and obviously we hope that whatever the federal government does with financial aid may benefit our students. 882 students in the class of 2012 are covered by Access U.Va. That brings the total number in Access U.Va. to 3,781. Friends and admirers, by the way, have been making fairly dramatic gifts to Access U.Va. I think all of us have joined in mourning Jack Blackburn. Jack's friends, largely organized by Gordon Burris, have contributed about $1.6 million so far to create a cluster of Access U.Va. scholarships. named for him. Other gifts have been numerous, and so I'm optimistic about the future with that program. I think the program is becoming a philanthropy of choice for donors who care about students, for donors who remember working through college themselves, and that's part of why the contributions have been so strong. A bit about managing the downturn. We have put strict limits on spending from all fund sources. Frankly, restricting all fund sources is a reflection of the fact that we are concerned about future events that we can't predict, including the duration of the recession. We will not fill vacancies except in the most extreme situations, and we will use whatever disciplines are required to make sure that we're able to cover instructional programs to maintain momentum while also controlling the number of vacancies. Existing and future vacant positions are very likely to remain unfilled, at least until we know the effects of the General Assembly's budget and of the stimulus package. I should emphasize something that everyone knows, but the provost controls all allocations or reallocations of faculty positions whenever a vacancy occurs anywhere. The notable exception is if there is an endowment that restricts a position to a certain department, and if the department or the dean has the funds to pay the spread between the actual cost of the position and the endowment revenue, then the provost is likely to respect that. But in any event, he still has to approve hires, advertising for positions, and so on. We're preventing layoffs now by planning ahead. The strategy goes as far forward in time as the budget does, which is to say through fiscal year 2010. We have to keep our eyes on the legislative skirmishes. The university's simply not prepared to save money by doing something that in fact costs money. Laying off personnel in universities is a false economy. Places that have done it have inevitably hurt their programs. It's simply not a strategy that makes sense for a university that intends to be the very best of its kind. We are centralizing and combining services to produce savings and improvements. We've done that before in tough times. We're seeking external funding for new academic programs. I should mention that the number of new commitments made in December is a kind of record, $42 million in new commitments to the capital campaign in that month. That's a fairly dramatic demonstration of the fact that when we tell our people that times are hard, they do in fact respond. We are seeking donor funds to cover shortfalls in funding for essential programs. If you're wondering where your deans are right now, most of them are off and on the road looking for those funds, because the responsibility of finding those falls primarily on the deans. New construction or renovation projects that depend on state funds are obviously on hold until the state decides what it will do. I should say that there are some that are intended to be financed by departmental operating funds or reserves. They are on hold also if they've not already started. And the reason is simply that those reserves may be necessary to maintain the programs themselves in this downturn. So as Leonard and Tim and others look at all funds that are available, they are looking at reserves as well as everything else. The privately funded projects will go ahead so long as the money is available. And frankly, there's a logic to that. The market is favorable. The cost of construction is down. On the other hand, the return on investments is not up. And so donors often want their money spent on the projects that they intend to finance now and not after waiting to see what the market does for a year or so. Our AAA bond rating, UVMCO's discipline, the strength of the tuition fund, the 2006 Restructuring Act are our best sources of financial strength and stability in this period. The planning that's gone into each of those, you know, if you followed these remarks over the years, many people here have contributed to the model, to the stewardship that's made those principles work. They all require very diligent attention in a downturn. All of them represent both products of and necessary conditions for the self-sufficiency that we had to develop when the state decided in the early 90s that higher education was no longer a top project or top priority. We have every intention of keeping you informed I've mentioned the virginia.edu/budget impact website. If you see something there that is not clear, or if you're looking for something that is not there, send an email to Leonard, to Tim, to me. We will find it and post it and give you the document as fast as we can. All of us respond to email when it comes. Let me back away from the hard news and go to something that I think is genuinely extraordinary. As you know, primarily our general faculty and our classified personnel, although many academic faculty also participate, are major donors to what is now called the Combined Virginia Campaign. This is the current version of the old community chest. We had 3,870 employees who made gifts to that campaign in December. This is the month when everything came down, but in December. And the gifts total $923,000. The goal for the year, the goal that the state assigned, was $675,000. So the employees who contributed beat the goal by almost a third. Last year we raised $888,000. So the 923 this year is a substantial increase over that. That's by far the largest total contributed by any agency in the state of Virginia. And it represents, by and large, the self-sacrificing efforts of individual employees who often do not make large salaries and who are simply determined to maintain community sources. The state's website on the topic is not up to date. It looks as though our employees contributed between a fifth and a fourth of the total fund raised by the state in the course of the campaign. And as I said, the selflessness of particularly classified employees and general faculty employees is amazing news. So if you are one of those employees, thank you and congratulations. If you supervise, oversee, or work with those employees, tell them thank you. That's a major piece of why community services work. Finally, let me talk a bit about converting crises to opportunities. We have two real choices in dealing with these budget cuts and the economy around us. One is to see the crisis as an excuse for mediocrity, for stasis, to say we will back off and we'll see how things are later. The other is to see the downturn as an opportunity for carefully conceived, wise, and bold actions, for innovative thinking. And the second option is the one that we've chosen. We will have even greater fiscal discipline, although frankly it's hard to imagine a better disciplined financial system than the one that Leonard and his colleagues have developed for us. We will have greater openness to novel ideas. We are listening to deans now who have proposals that are not covered in any budget, but proposals that have tremendous promise as we find the means to finance them. We are committed to sharper strategic thinking, and I'll talk a bit about strategies toward the end of these remarks, because we have to make some hard choices. And frankly, we're going to have to change once again, as we have repeatedly in these last 2 decades. We're going to have to change once again in the ways in which we do business and the targets that we set for the business of being a superb university. And we're going to have to develop even greater market sense and market responsiveness. We've never had the luxury of drawing 35% of our budget from one source that we controlled. We don't have the problem that some of our neighbors have. We also have, I guess I would say, habits of stringency that serve us well in periods of this kind. We are continuing to invest in new academic programs, in new buildings. We are continuing the efforts that you know about. Ground was broken on 2 of the 3 new science buildings this fall. Other projects are moving along. I've dropped out the list of projects. They're in your book. The strategy for implementing the plans outlined in the report of the Commission on the Future of the University has not changed. Our intention is to strengthen our core resources while funding selected new programs that will distinguish the university itself. I wanted to mention a few examples of the way in which that motion is going on. In order to build a foundation for the Jefferson Public Citizens Program this semester, there are 6 new courses intended to engage students in academically based service activities. There will be more of that. In mid-February, students can apply for grants to fund the first independent Jefferson Public Scholars Program courses, Public Citizens courses. We expect about 20 JPC student teams to be authorized and funded, and we're looking to provide faculty grants for additional course developments in the spring semester. Some 30 faculty members have now been invited to join the Institute for Faculty Advancement, which Dean Hostler oversees. They have come to us with nominations from their deans, from senior faculty members. They're identified as people of extraordinary promise. 16 of the 30 who've been invited are women. 9 of the 30 have self-identified themselves as members of racial or ethnic minorities. So we are seeing leadership begin to emerge in areas that all of us have seen as being important to the university's current and future good health. As I mentioned, we have broken ground on 2 of the 3 major science facilities to which the board has committed. We are creating new cross-school programs that have to do with sustainability, with biosciences, with innovation. Tom Skalek's effort to set priorities and to fund those priorities are working. And that is, I think, a significant step forward, especially in the climate in which we work. An advisory council for international programs is now developing school-based international programs. Faculty members are writing the program proposals. The model includes faculty grants to develop international courses and study abroad programs when they can meet gaps in our current portfolio of offerings. We're not trying simply to get there, we're trying to get to the right places there and be better wherever we go. New academic programs. The BIS program has now been expanded to Northern Virginia because of local requests there. Northern Virginia Community College is the host. That gives us a second major site in addition to Charlottesville where this program for adult learners is offered. We are now looking at the prospect of expanding that program, possibly statewide, possibly beyond the state, by using interactive video, which engineering and the Curry School have used for a generation to teach courses away from Charlottesville, and by developing skills in online education. We believe that we can meet the unmet need for degree programs for part-time adult students on a statewide basis in a way that is practical because these 2 programs, Tidewater and Northern Virginia, have worked so well. New Master of Science in Commerce. In the fall of 2008, the McIntire School began offering this MS. It's a 5th-year degree program for recent graduates. It receives no state support, but the program currently enrolls 47 students. It's taught here in Charlottesville. We will eventually put that into other markets where there is a demand for the kind of program the McIntire School offers. There's a program called Produced in Virginia, which is a joint project of the university, specifically the School of Engineering, and the community colleges, and its purpose is to provide engineering education on site using distance learning and off-site classes in places where students are place-bound because of their employment. The most important evidence of this is a program that was started in fall of 2007 in Lynchburg in collaboration with Central Virginia Community College. We planned on 32 students on the basis of a survey of the market. We got 120 students. If you want to know where the demand for UVA is, it's in places like Lynchburg and Richmond and Roanoke and Washington and Delhi. There are opportunities far beyond anything that we've imagined as we put the right programs in front of the right populations. We have more of these programs coming. Again, there is no state money committed to these programs. In this morning's paper, you will have learned that Curry School faculty members Carolyn Callahan and Holly Herbert Davis have a newly funded federal grant, $2.2 million, to analyze the levels at which high school students from underrepresented populations perform in AP courses, and then to develop and implement a program that will be conducted here in the summertime to increase those students' access to and success in AP. If one wants to know why our programs receive such strong students in the beginning, the answer is AP and IB. It has to do with the way in which the schools that send us students have used those programs as the core of their curriculum. Again, the state is not contributing. There is a new pilot program that will offer 2 summer arts awards to support undergraduates' projects in the creative arts, funding for students working in music, drama, dance, the visual arts, and so on, under the guidance of faculty advisors. The college and the Center for Undergraduate Excellence are sponsoring the program. There is no state money in that program. That program, by the way, complements the Harrison Research Awards that now support about 45 undergraduate research projects each year. It also complements the U21 undergraduate and graduate research programs and a number of other similar programs, one sponsored, for example, by the Raven Society, that have developed since Mr. Harrison's first gift for that purpose. It's an interesting case, by the way, of a man with an eccentric idea, help undergraduates pay for research, who has had a global impact. The U21 programs are everywhere, and they're knockoffs of Mr. Harrison's initial idea. None of these programs has received state support. Last week, we named Harry Harding the first dean of the Batten School. I think all of us have had a chance to look at or to follow some of his work. He's an expert on Southeast Asia, most notably China. Most recently, he was University Professor of International Affairs at George Washington, where he also chaired their School of Public Service. Was the dean of that school for a decade. He joins 5 other new deans appointed in the last year to school positions. Paul Mahoney in law, Meredith Wu in the college, Dory Fontaine in nursing, Steve Dukoski in medicine, Billy Canaday in the School of Continuing and Professional Studies, which is obviously a special target of our interest now that we're looking for ways to generate enrollments and revenues away from Charlottesville. And I should mention also that Greg Roberts has been named Dean of Admissions to succeed Jack Blackburn. I think all but Steve may be here today, so if you'd like to meet the new deans, they're in this area. Come down when we finish. Some information on diversity. As you may know, there are new data on national demographics that came out last summer. They finally allow for comparison that goes back 2 or 3 years. Among 61 AAU universities, we moved from 12th to 8th in the number of African American faculty, from 59th to 58th in the number of Asian and Asian American faculty. We hung at 59th with regard to Hispanic faculty. We declined from 48th to 57th in the number of women on the faculty. So it is a mixed picture. There's plenty of work to be done. Department heads, deans, persons running searches, I think can look at these numbers and figure out that we have done things that work, and we've also not met our targets in other areas. The number of applicants for the fall entering class shows some extraordinary changes in the makeup of the pool. The number of African American students who applied last year was 1,298. This year it's 1,567. The number of American Indian or Native American or Alaskan Native students who applied has gone from 71 last year to 163 this year. The number of Asian students has gone from 2,191 last year to 2,918 this year. The number of Hispanic students from 831 last year to 1,227 this year. The number of Caucasian students from 11,019 last year to 12,599 this year. And also the number of non-resident alien students, international students, has gone from 1,490 last year to 2,170 this year. The overall pool has gone from 18,598 to 21,686. The message that the university is the place to be is everywhere. The challenge is to find ways to accommodate extraordinarily talented students coming to this place looking for the kind of challenges that have made us well known. There are reasons for the increases. It's not just that we're famous. Greg is an expert on them. Some of them have to do simply with the nature of the application. But in any event, the increases are there. We also show commitment to diversity by working with small, women-owned and minority-owned businesses. There's interesting information now about the successes there. We've placed 42.5% of our discretionary spending with these businesses in fiscal year 08. The exact totals in minority business interests about 3.1%. Women's business interest 3.9%, the small business is 35.5%. The 42.5% surpasses the state's 40% goal. Minority spending is especially interesting because by comparison to 2007, it has grown by 64%. So the figures reflect both tremendous progress and obviously also opportunities. Capital campaign, as you know, is continuing to move. It's very unusual in this economy. There are about 10 campaigns that were the scale of ours when they were announced. Of those, half or so have been scaled back or slowed down. Economic reality will eventually force us to rethink some of what we're doing, but we're not panicking. The targets, which are arbitrary, and the dollars committed are tracking right on the curve that you would draw for the targets. From what we can tell, the flow of large gifts will not stop, and large gifts are the bulk of the $1.85 billion raised so far. We believe we're on target to reach $2 billion sometime in the coming spring. Obviously, also, we need substantial numbers of smaller donors. So the work that your deans do in building annual support is critical, and annual support quite often turns into capital support. The strategies and the immediate results that we'll use may change because of the nature of this downturn. I think all of us learned in the 1990s that you build successes on periods of adversity. We'll do it again. In severe recessions, when confidence in government itself is shaken, and frankly, I cannot remember a period in which confidence in government was so much depressed as it was toward the end of the last fiscal year. Donors are likely to choose what they can do today, what their dollars will demonstrably produce today, which is often buildings, as opposed to putting their money into long-term investments such as endowments. They have the same concerns about investing that you and I have. Many fear that government may not be able to repair this economy, at least not in the predictable short term. The fact that it is a global recession is a further complication because many of our larger donors are in global businesses. They're perfectly aware of what's happening in Malaysia or in Africa or in the European Union. The reason we're succeeding, frankly, is hard work. We have many volunteers, not least among them Gordon Rainey, whom I hope you've all met, but in any event, the most indefatigable volunteer I've ever seen. A man who literally goes anywhere at any time to make the case for support for the university. He chairs the campaign like many of our volunteers and Bob Sweeney and his staff and your deans. He has gone through the long nights of travel, the thousands of contacts. He has helped to build the base of support. Many of these people come here to visit. You can sometimes help. We need the support of people who come to look at the work that we do, to support the work. The extraordinary progress in recent months in the museum, and if you've not seen the current exhibitions in the museum, walk over there, are one of the reasons for excitement about what's happening. I'm told that for the first time in history, we had students lined up to the end of the block to get into the opening night of that exhibition. So if you haven't been, go get into line. I think you'll find that the value of that as a draw to bring people here is tangible. We've responded to state cuts in different ways through our history, generally in ways not like what our neighbors have done. And frankly, the cuts that we see are common all over the system of public education. More so in Virginia, but they are everywhere. In 1992-93, the appropriation was cut by $19.2 million. We learned from that how to raise money. We went to our donors and we said we can't operate without replacement dollars. And alumni groups, parents of friends, and others provided those dollars. We also learned from that experience the value of an endowment as one of the factors in the fund flow. And so we started building what has become one of the nation's great endowments. Even after all the losses, it's still the 20th largest endowment in the country. 3 rounds of budget cuts in 2002 through 4 left us with this historically large budget reduction, $51+ million. That was almost a third of the state-based budget that came out in those reductions. We learned at that point how to use endowment returns and gifts in a mixed fund stream to make sure that our programs could flourish. Most faculty members at the time told me that they could barely feel the effects of the downturn. I can promise you that your deans and those who work with Leonard and so on felt it pretty abruptly. But the management of the downturn was superb. The next major infusion, and here I want to talk a bit about strategies, of operating capital for our university, I think is going to have to be earned. I don't think that in a recession of this kind, that was kept secret for so long, it's reasonable to say that one can do what we did in the early 90s, or do what we did in the late 90s, to build fund flow and then to build the endowment. We have to generate new earned revenue. I mentioned the enrollment in the Virginia Produces program in Lynchburg and the fact that the demand is out there. The regional centers, distance learning, and quality assurance programs to protect students and the university. And then the market savvy to penetrate new markets, including markets outside the United States. Imagine what a sliver of the audience for executive education programs in Asia is worth. A tiny piece of a percentage. And imagine the value of being the University of Virginia and having the accreditations and having the experience in executive education, having built the kinds of programs that law, the Darden School, many programs in the college, the McIntyre School can offer. Imagine what we can do in places where we have never been, but where our name is known. Between U21 and the general excellence of the university, we are known everywhere now. And it's time to begin to exploit that kind of fame or notoriety in order to build new ventures that will produce revenue to sustain the university. So new ventures for us, new ways of doing work, very hard work, potentially work that's as rewarding and essential to future excellence here as anything that we've done since 1990. And hard organizational challenges. The challenges involved in doing online education well are substantial. Not the obvious ones. Everybody thought it was the cost of the computer systems. It's millage. They're licensed out. You don't buy them. You pay license fees just as you use for any other kind of software. But the marketing, the quality assurance, the design of programs that are relevant to the conditions in the countries or the places where students are, those are challenges. Very few American universities have succeeded at this. The demand for the service is huge. It's everywhere. But our success as a national system of education in meeting that is very, very limited. And indeed, there are some very famous failures. The ventures tried by the Ivy League schools 15 years ago uniformly failed. The successes now, and they include some of those institutions, Harvard, MIT, Chicago, and so on. The successes now are much more hard-headed business. That's where we have to go to meet that market. We will meet these challenges and we will succeed. But we will be once more a new university when we're done. If you've been here through these years in which we have changed because of what's going on around us, you know that you have worked in 3 or 4 universities over those years. That the self-reinvention has been the characteristic of greatness in this place. We will do that again. This outlook today is dire. If you haven't read your TIAA-CREF reports, do it. It's a chastening experience. But I believe, and everyone I know who's studied the economy believes, that the recovery that we're looking for will come eventually. The question is how and why. Can the stimulus program in the short term damp some of the effect? Can strategic investments in infrastructure in the longer term rebuild the structure of the economy? For us, the challenge is to work together, to work smarter, to work more strategically than ever before, and to understand that we will come out of this downturn a stronger and a smarter university. We've done that before, we'll do it again. Faculty members, staff members, students, parents, alumni, neighbors, support and give life to our university. They have done so more so in the last couple of decades than ever in our history, along with hundreds of thousands of other people. including faculty members and staff members and students and parents and alumni and neighbors. I am grateful to you because the women and men who are the university have made it successful as it has gone through these migrations of the last generation. We will do it again. Thank you.